Well, thank you very much. I'm not sure that I'm pretty sure that I don't warrant the label of hero, but I am very honored to be here at the Clinton School. President Clinton was first president that I voted for that actually won, so I'm feel like he was my president and was an inspiration to me. And to be here for a distinguished speaker series and looking at the really distinguished lectures that you've had is very humbling to see heads of state and secretaries of state, and to be me, a lowly untenured associate professor and lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force JAG Corps, was very humbling. Now, to the extent that I am a distinguished person and have gained some notoriety, that really should never have happened at all. And because my notoriety arose from the fact that the United States of America tortured a teenage boy and attempted to subject him to trial as a war criminal for a non-existent war crime, making him potentially the first child soldier ever to be tried in the history of the civilized world. That should not have happened in the United States of America, and I was pleased to have had the opportunity to play a role in making sure that perhaps that won't happen again. Let me tell you a little bit about myself and how I got into Guantanamo. I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions because I'm sure many of you are curious about Guantanamo, and I'm probably the only person in the room who's been there, so I can tell you about it. I graduated law school, Harvard Law School in 1994, and after clerking for a federal judge for a year, I did the unthinkable and joined the military, eschewing very high-paid jobs at law firms to serve the public, and that's what I wanted to do. So I commend and applaud the students here at the Clinton School of Public Service. I think had there been such an institution at the time that I was considering grad school, I might have done that instead of law school, because I always wanted to do something in the public interest. And I explored some different options in law school, environmental law and civil rights, and decided to join the service. And the oath that we take as officers in the United States Armed Forces, indeed the President and other federal officials take a similar oath, is to defend the Constitution of the United States. It's very interesting that those words are chosen. We don't take an oath to defend the United States. We take an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States. But quite frankly, in my 10 years of active duty military service, I didn't really feel that much on a day-to-day basis that I was defending the Constitution of the United States. I was a military prosecutor, I was a military defense counsel, and certainly understood I was part of the system of due process that protected people's constitutional rights, and of course I was part of the Armed Forces Officer Corps, and that we certainly play a role in defending the Constitution, but it wasn't direct and tangible. But at Guantanamo, I definitely felt that I was fulfilling my oath in a very concrete way. Now, in 2005, I left active duty and became a law professor, and I joined the Air Force Reserve JAG Corps, so I was a military lawyer. And as a young professor, of course, you have to write articles. You got to publish. So I wrote an article about the new military commissions. In 2006, Congress passed the Military Commissions Act, which authorized detainees at Guantanamo to be tried for war crimes. and, I should add, crimes, terrorism crimes, which previously had not been considered war crimes. And this is one of the controversial aspects of the military commissions, is that it seemed to enlarge the subject matter jurisdiction of military commissions to encompass material support to terrorism, conspiracy to commit terrorist acts. Anyway, I wrote an article comparing military courts martial, which is the legal system that I had the most experience with, and these new military commissions. And what the administration was saying, and the Department of Defense was saying at the time, was that these two systems were essentially identical, that the rights being given to detainees were unprecedented in scope and magnitude and were essentially equivalent to what our own soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines get. And so I decided to explore that issue, and I wrote this paper comparing the two legal systems. And what I found was that there were some very significant differences. And the Pentagon spokespeople like to say that military commissions were 99% the same as courts martial. And I felt that if that were true, it was true in the same way that humans and rats share 99% of the DNA, because it's that last 1% that's the crucial 1%, right? And so there were some significant disparities in the two systems. Probably the most glaring problem with the military commissions was the admissibility of evidence that was obtained through coercion. And that was something that was very troubling and very controversial about the military commissions. So anyway, I wrote this article, and in the winter of 2008, I got a solicitation from the Department of Defense. They were looking for volunteers to serve as military prosecutors or military defense counsel in the military commissions. And the Military Commissions Act requires that any detainee charged in the military commissions be provided with a free military defense lawyer. So since I had some qualms about this system, and I didn't want to be a prosecutor in that system, but I decided to volunteer to be a defense counsel. And I felt like, given the troubling way that we had handled detainees and some of the mistreatment that they had suffered, that at the very least we could provide them with a vigorous legal defense. And I didn't know what clients I might be assigned, but I was accepted for the position. And so at the end of my spring semester of law school in April of 2008, I reported to Washington, D.C., where the Office of Military Commissions is located. Now, of course, the courthouse, if you will, is in Guantanamo, but the day-to-day work of the military commissions is conducted in Washington, D.C. That's where where the discovery goes back and forth and where we write our legal memos and such. So I packed up my stuff and put it in a yellow Ryder truck and drove across the country, and it was considered a deployment. I deployed to Washington, D.C., so lived on Capitol Hill, and it was a very interesting time. And when I arrived, my new boss, well, first he said, well, your office is down the hall. So I walked down the hall, and there was a person who was clearing out the office. And he said, oh, you must be the new guy. I said, yeah, I'm the new guy. He said, well, let me give you a piece of advice. It was a colonel, full colonel. I was a major at the time. I said, okay, sir. He said, don't start thinking that you can win one of these cases. Do yourself a favor. Don't get your hopes up. This is a system that is rigged against you. It's stacked. You know, we're here to provide window dressing because you're not going to win one of these cases, and certainly don't get your clients' hopes up. I said, oh, okay, well, thank you very much, sir. So I got settled in the office, and then I went to see my new boss, and I said, who was that guy? He said, oh, well, that's the lawyer you're replacing. You're taking over his 2 cases, and you have 2 hearings next week. Both of your clients are being arraigned next week in Guantanamo, so get yourself on a plane tomorrow. Now, anyone who has followed military commissions at Guantanamo would know that they have moved at an excruciatingly slow pace. In many cases, military defense counsel and prosecutors have done a 2 or 3 year tour in Washington, D.C. without ever setting foot in the courtroom of the military commissions. So it was completely unprecedented for a lawyer to be assigned as lead counsel, solo counsel, for 2 cases that had already been charged and were going to arraignment the following week. So I was thrown in head first in a way that no one else had. I don't know if this was just due to a personnel shortage or that my boss actually thought I could handle it, but to give you a sense of a little bit of the waste of resources involved in Guantanamo, I was given my own plane to fly to Guantanamo. And I didn't fly myself, but the Army they took one of the planes that they usually fly generals around in, and they flew me down along with my 2 translators. I had 1 Arabic translator and 1 Pashto translator. My 2 clients were very different. We hear a lot about Guantanamo being the worst of the worst, and the critics of Guantanamo say, well, a lot of people there are innocent, and they're farmers or sheep herders. They were people in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I got to see that there was truth to both of those statements. My first client, Ali Hamza Al Bahlul, was a Yemeni who had moved to Afghanistan because he was a fanatically committed member of Al-Qaeda, deeply loyal to Osama bin Laden. He became bin Laden's personal secretary and media advisor. Some called him the propaganda minister of Al-Qaeda. He created recruiting videos and other products for Al-Qaeda. When I met him, he told me that he was sorry I had wasted my time in coming down there, that he was very polite and very cordial, but he said, I'm Al-Qaeda, you're a U.S. military officer, you're the enemy. If I had the opportunity, I would kill you. Nothing personal. So I don't want you representing me before any military commissions. I don't recognize the legitimacy of these proceedings. I only answer to Islamic law, to Allah, and you can do what you want to me, but you're not representing me. My other client was very different. He was a young boy, well, not so young anymore, because he had been at Guantanamo at that point for nearly 6 years. But at the time that he was captured, he was, to the best of our ability to determine, about 15 years old. He was arrested in connection with a grenade attack. Someone, and we still don't know who to this day, threw a hand grenade into an American military jeep in a crowded bazaar in downtown Kabul in broad daylight on December 17th, 2002. It was the first attack of its kind in Kabul since Kabul fell to U.S. and Northern Alliance forces very early in the war. And it caused quite an uproar. Now, fortunately, the grenade did not kill the 2 U.S. Special Forces soldiers. They were wearing their Kevlar vests. They got a lot of shrapnel wounds, but they survived. But as you can imagine, when a hand grenade explodes in a crowded public space, people went panicked and started running and scattering in all directions. And the Afghan police quickly responded to the scene and started arresting people, just grabbing everybody that was running away. And one of the people that they grabbed was a barefoot, in December, mind you, teenager who had no identity papers, no money, therefore no money to pay a bribe to be released, named Mohammed Jawad. And he and many others were taken into the local police station for questioning. The Americans were very angry about this attack. They said these are terrorists. They rolled in in force with armored vehicles to this police station and said, "You will turn over the persons responsible to us." And it was quite a tense exchange, actually, with, and ultimately the Interior Minister of Afghanistan had to personally appear and sort of broker a deal, and in which they promised they would, after some initial questioning, they would turn over the suspects. Well, after several hours, they did turn over one person to the Americans, and they said, here's the person responsible. Now, what had happened, Mohammed was told that if he did not confess, he would be killed, or a member of his family would be killed. And he said, but I didn't do it. And they said, that's really beside the point. They then broke his nose and prepared a confession for him. It was a handwritten confession. It was written by the police. Jawad was illiterate. And then they told him that they were going to release him and and asked him to place his thumbprint on a piece of paper, which he did. That thumbprint was then attached to the written confession and given to the American, said, here is his signed confession. He's the person solely responsible for the attack. The next morning, the Afghan Interior Minister held a press conference in which he announced that the 3 foreign terrorists responsible for the grenade attack had been captured and had confessed. But the Americans didn't know about that. They were told that this teenage boy was the one responsible. He was handcuffed, blindfolded, hooded, and driven to the outskirts of town where there was a Special Forces forward operating base, taken ostensibly for a medical examination, but they stripped him naked and took a series of nude photographs of him. In Islamic culture, I mean, it would be humiliating for any teenage boy to be subjected to such treatment, but in Islamic culture particularly, this was incredibly degrading. He believed that he was going to be killed. And they then began to interrogate him using a technique, which is a lawful technique, but it's a scary technique called fear up harsh. That's the official name in the Army Field Manual, which basically involves people yelling at you in a drill instructor-like voice, and keep in mind that these were Marines, and they had been told that that he spoke English, so initially they were yelling at him in English, but finally there was an interpreter there. He said, I don't think he understands anything, so then he said, let me translate. So then they yelled at him in English, and the translator yelled at him and so finally he said, oh, okay, I didn't do it. I had nothing to do with it. I'm innocent. Oh, well, we have your sworn written confession right here. No, that's, I didn't do it. Well, after several hours of interrogation, which was all videotaped, he confessed. Now, his confession was completely different, or I should say, alleged confession. Why do I say alleged? The videotape subsequently disappeared. So there was no, and because it was being videotaped, they didn't take any kind of verbatim record or written statement from him, which of course he couldn't write anyway. The only accounts we have of what he said during that interrogation was the vague recollections of the interrogators several years later, after they had interrogated thousands of other people. One of them said he didn't remember anything. But the story that he allegedly told was completely different than the story that was contained in the handwritten confession. About 4 in the morning, they finished, gave him something to eat, and told him he could go to sleep, and the next morning they took him to Bagram prison, where he was held and very badly treated, beaten, shoved down stairs, concrete stairs, while chained to the ceiling in uncomfortable positions, subjected to extreme cold with minimal clothing for extended periods of time. Bagram prison actually, in the fall of 2002 and winter of 2003, was the worst detention facility ever run by the United States during the War on Terror. The abuses that occurred there far exceeded anything at Abu Ghraib or indeed at Guantanamo. At least two prisoners were beaten to death there. Dilawar and Habibullah. There's a documentary film, Taxi to the Dark Side, which describes how they were killed. And there later was an extensive Army CID investigation which determined that those were homicides. And over 20 American soldiers confessed to various forms of detainee abuse, the vast majority of whom were never punished at all. So Jawad arrived kind of at the wrong place at the wrong time, and he was interrogated more than a dozen times at Bagram, but interestingly continued to assert his innocence. February 6, 2003, he was transferred to Guantanamo, where he was interrogated over the next 4 years, another 48 times, every time proclaimed his innocence. At one point, a sympathetic interrogator said, you know, I can get you out of here, we can get you in school and you can learn something. And he said, what do I have to do? He said, well, you know, you just have to confess. And he said, well, if you want me to confess to something I didn't do, I will, but, you know, I didn't do it. So in December of 2003, after 8 months or so at Guantanamo, Jawad, 15, 16 years old, his family had not been told that he was alive, that he was at Guantanamo. He had no contact with them at that point, became very desperate, very depressed, and tried to commit suicide in his cell by banging his head against the wall and by trying to tie a scarf around, you know, something in the room. That failed. A few months after that, he was subjected to something called the frequent flyer sleep deprivation program. This was a program where detainees were moved from cell to cell every 2 to 3 hours to keep them from sleeping. And understand, moving from cell to cell, you have to be shackled. Your hands are shackled, your feet are shackled. There's a chain that runs from one to the other. 3 guards are involved. They're not particularly gentle about it, typically. And he described to me that as being the worst thing that he had experienced, worse than the physical beatings, was the sleep deprivation. This information came directly from the Guantanamo detention records, which were provided to me by the prosecutor. I asked for all the records, and he gave them to me. So I went down there with this Pashto translator, and one of the things I asked him to do was take a look at this handwritten confession. And said, you know, I had a translation of it that had been provided by the prosecution. I said, but I wanted to make sure it was accurate. And I said, can you look at this and translate it for me? He said, no, I can't. I said, well, why not? He said, that's not in Pashto. That's in Dari. Dari is the other major language spoken in Afghanistan. It's a variant of Farsi. So you mean to tell me that this alleged confession of my client, who is illiterate even in Pashto, is written in a language that he doesn't even speak? Yes. Well, when I told the prosecutor that, and when he learned about the frequent flyer program and other things that had happened to Jawad, he began to have some grave doubts about his own case, and ultimately sought to have the charges dismissed, but the chief prosecutor would not allow it, nor would he allow any kind of reasonable plea bargain. And Jawad continued to assert his innocence, and I told him, I said, well, you know, if you just, maybe you could confess to just being there, you know, just an accessory, an accomplice, you know. Maybe I could get you out of here. And he said, Major Frakt, there's two ways that I can get out of Guantanamo. He said, I can get out of here as a free man, or I can get out of here as a convicted criminal. He said, I don't care how long it takes. I want to get out of here as a free man. So that's what I attempted to do. And the way that I attempted to do it was essentially by putting the United States on trial for its mistreatment and abuse of a teenage boy. The prosecutor, opposing counsel, ultimately decided he could not ethically continue the prosecution and resigned. Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Vandevelde, that's the person I consider to be a true American hero, because he did something that put himself, his career, at risk, and indeed was very poorly treated by the Army in response. And he stood up and spoke out and became a defense witness and testified before Congress that he believed that Jawad was innocent, and wrote an affidavit in support of our habeas corpus petition. Truly remarkable, and one of 7 Guantanamo military prosecutors who chose to resign rather than participate in what they saw as unfairness. I don't see a clock anywhere in here. How am I doing on time? I put the United States on trial. I filed a motion to have the charges dismissed on the basis of outrageous government conduct. And I didn't win that motion, but the judge did make a very important ruling, and he ruled that the mistreatment of Mohammed Jawad was inhumane, was cruel and unusual, was humiliating and degrading, and the persons responsible should face disciplinary action. He also ruled in a separate motion that the confessions of Mohammed Jawad, such as they were the product not merely of coercion, but of torture, and therefore inadmissible in a military commission. Now, the government claimed to have additional evidence. They said, we've got an eyewitness who saw him, a reliable eyewitness who saw him throw that hand grenade. So, and he was an Afghan military police officer, fairly senior one. Now, I didn't really want to go to Afghanistan, I have to admit, but I was lucky. I had a Marine working for me, and Marines, you know, they're really gung-ho. So I said, hey, why don't you go to Afghanistan? Check this out. So he did. And there's another American hero, Major Eric Montalvo, now retired. He went to Afghanistan in the middle of the war, into Kabul, and he found that police officer and several other witnesses. And the first words out of the mouth of the police officer were, well, the prosecution gave me $400, so what are you going to give me? Well, that's music to the ears of a defense counsel, right? We have a corrupt witness, someone who can be bought. And Major Montalvo said, well, can you show me where you were? How did you see this all unfold? He said, oh, well, you know, I was in this restaurant. He said, take me there. Well, he took him in this restaurant. It was there by the public bazaar. And he said, well, where were you sitting? And they went back to this table, and they sat down, and he had the camera with him, and he took a picture. And what the picture showed is that there was a window. The window was covered with maybe 200 or 300 years worth of lamb grease. You couldn't see out that window. And even if you could, it had no angle on where the attack had actually taken place, which was 100 yards to the right of this place. And as Montalvo talked to other witnesses, they said, oh, that cop, he wasn't here. He arrived like 10 minutes later and just started giving orders and thought he was some kind of Rambo. And in fact, his story was that he had personally arrested Jawad, the terrorist, that he had run after him, that he had tackled him and thrown him to the ground, and they had rolled around in a tussle because he was a kung fu master, and that his clothes had come flying off in this melee. And this is where the nude pictures came in handy, because the nude pictures showed that aside from the broken nose, Jawad didn't have a scratch on him. So we had this guy, we knew he was lying, and once again presented the information to the prosecution. And as I told you, the lead prosecutor quit, but they found somebody else who was on active duty, who needed the job, and you know, so they continued to prosecute. But they had no case, is the bottom line. And so I continued to file motion after motion, and the case was going nowhere until January 2009, when President Obama was inaugurated, and he immediately suspended all military commission activities. Now, one of the other important constitutional decisions regarding Guantanamo was the decision of the Supreme Court to grant the right or affirm the right of habeas corpus of detainees. And they had done that in 2004. Congress had then stripped a right of habeas corpus, and the Supreme Court had said, no, you can't do that, in the summer of 2008. So we filed a habeas corpus petition. We said, look, the case is stalled right now. He's been there for 6, 7 years. We found a federal judge who was willing to get the case moving, and she asked the government to produce whatever evidence they had that he was an enemy combatant and should be detained. And they said, oh, well, this is the Justice Department. Said, here, we have the confessions right here. And I said, you mean the confessions that were suppressed by the military commissions? Military commissions, that's not a real court. We're not bound by that. The judge said, oh, well, then I'll have my own motion to suppress. And you can convince me that these statements should be admissible in an American court of law. Well, on the eve of that suppression hearing, the government changed its mind. And they said, you know what, we agree. These statements really were the product of torture. We're not going to use them. And the judge said, okay, well, what other evidence do you have? Because we're going to have a trial on the merits, and you're going to produce a witness. And they said, okay, Your Honor. And on the eve of that trial, they said, you know what? We don't have a witness. We don't have any evidence. He's not we made a mistake. He's not an enemy combatant after all. And so, on July 31st, 2008, some 6.5 years after his capture, the federal judge granted the writ of habeas corpus and ordered him to be released. I went to the convening authority, that's the person in charge of the military commissions. I said, you don't have jurisdiction. He's not an enemy combatant. You need to dismiss these charges. And she did, without prejudice. If any lawyers in the crowd will appreciate, you know, wanted to keep their options open for the future. But 3 weeks later, he was returned to Afghanistan, where he's a free man and has thus far stayed out of trouble. So my other client, Hamza Al Bahlul, declined my assistance, was put on trial, was the second person to be tried at Guantanamo in an actual trial, was convicted on all charges, was given a life sentence, and remains in Guantanamo to this day and potentially for the rest of his life. So I had two satisfied clients. Got exactly what they wanted. Okay, that's a little bit about my experience at Guantanamo. I would love to have the opportunity to answer your questions if there's any time remaining. And you can ask me, it doesn't have to be about commissions. Yes, sir.
I'd love you to stay all afternoon, and I will stay with you.
All right, sure.
Probably the first thing that comes to me is, as a man who volunteered for military service, served as defense counsel wearing a uniform, what do you think about Guantanamo? I mean, the never having served in the military, it strikes me as a blot on the system of laws in this country to have a spot where we just hide people away from the jurisdiction of the federal courts.
Yes, well, I certainly agree with you. And you know, the important thing to understand is why Guantanamo was chosen and what it was intended to be. Guantanamo was specifically chosen as the site for the detention camp because it was believed by the Bush administration to be beyond the reach of the law. And they asserted that it was a legal black hole where detainees had no rights under the law of war, no rights under the Geneva Conventions, the Constitution did not apply, nothing applied. They had no access to courts, counsel, no ability to challenge the basis for their confinement, no ability to be told the basis for their confinement. And it was American lawyers, and including many United States Armed Forces lawyers who were later assigned to represent detainees, who challenged that position and ultimately won a number of rights for the detainees. So I did consider Guantanamo to be an embarrassment and a blot on our national reputation. Now today I must say that Guantanamo is a well-run, humane, safe prison facility. The abuses, the enhanced interrogation techniques and so forth are a thing of the past. The modern military commissions, in their now third version under the Military Commissions Act of 2009, are a reasonably fair legal system that does now is pretty close to what you would get in a court-martial or an American criminal courtroom. Had they started that way, I think it would have passed constitutional muster and they could have tried a bunch of people by now. As it is, 4 people have pled guilty, 2 have been tried after 10 years, while in the federal courts during that same period, over 400 people have been convicted of terrorism-related charges. So I do think it should be closed because even though it is now a well-run and humane facility, it remains a symbol and a highly effective recruiting tool for our enemies who point to Obama's promise to close it and the failure to do that as evidence that nothing has really changed here in the United States, even though conditions there are different than they were initially. Other questions?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone, please.
I read, did a little research and I did a little reading, and this could be totally wrong, but what I read was that the lease for Guantanamo was signed either right after or during the Spanish-American War by an officer of the United States for Cuba, and the lease only provided that the space be used as a refueling port, which would mean we have no right to have a military base there or a prison or have prisons there or trials there. Do you have any opinion as to any of that?
Well, that is a very interesting point, you know, and that's something that was a sore point with Fidel Castro for many years, that we were exceeding the scope of the lease. Now, for a long time, we had very friendly relations with Cuba, and they were more than happy to have us doing whatever we wanted there, which was contributing to their economy and so forth. Interestingly, the lease payment, which is, I think, a few $1,000s a year, we do continue to send a check to the Cuban government every year, and for the last 20 or 30 years, they have not cashed those checks. But so that the question is, well, what recourse would the Cubans have? And there's They could potentially, try to take us to the International Court of Justice in The Hague or to the Inter-American Court for Human Rights to try to protest, but so far they haven't done anything like that. But it is true that we have probably no legal right to have a prison there at all. You had a question, ma'am? You want the...
Peggy, wait for the microphone.
How representative do you feel that your experience was? Because in a time of war, it's really important to know the enemy and deal with the enemy. But if we're distracted with a lot of fake enemies who aren't really involved and can't really give us any good information because they weren't there, they don't know. So what's your sense of the proportion of valid cases versus less valid?
Okay, I can tell you with some precision the makeup of the Guantanamo population. Now, there were 787 prisoners who passed through Guantanamo, spent some time at Guantanamo. The Bush administration had released over 500 of those themselves after determining that they really didn't have a basis to hold them there. So at the time that President Obama assumed office, there was 300, or somewhere right around 300. And already another additional 100 of those detainees had been cleared for release. Now, President Obama set up a task force, an interagency task force, to thoroughly review every single person that remained at Guantanamo and figure out, and it turned out that they didn't even have complete files or dossiers on many of these people, and they spent many months collecting and collating records from the different agencies until they had a complete picture of who was there. And they determined after that exhaustive, what was supposed to be a 3-month review turned into a 14-month review, that there were 36 detainees that they felt could and should be tried either in federal court or in a military commission for crimes, that they had evidence of actual crimes. There were an additional 48 that they believed to be dangerous terrorists, but that they did not have evidence that would be admissible in a court upon which to prosecute them, but they were so dangerous they did not feel in good faith that they could be released. So 84 people were, what we might say, legitimate terrorists. There was another, the remainder could be transferred or released to other countries. The problem was that most other countries, when we asked them to accept our detainees, they said, well, we'll accept some of your released detainees if you accept some released detainees into the United States. If you're saying these people aren't dangerous, they didn't do anything, then, why don't you take a couple? But politically, that was unfeasible here in the U.S., and so we had to twist arms and try to get other countries to take a few. An interesting case is the Uyghurs, a group of Chinese Muslims. There were, I think, 17 of them who had fled political persecution in China to Afghanistan. Now, what happened in Afghanistan at the beginning of the war is we dropped leaflets all over the country saying, turn in a foreign terrorist to the U.S. and we'll give you $5,000. So that's where most of the people that we got at Guantanamo came from. And most of them didn't know anything, and it took us years to sort that out. Colin Powell's chief of staff, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, said already by the early summer of 2002, the top level of the Bush administration knew that most of the people at Guantanamo were innocent, but because they said they could not admit that, so they were just going to hold them anyway, which I find absolutely appalling. So yes, there are some legitimate bad guys who would love to inflict as much damage on the United States as possible at Guantanamo. There are also a number of people who went in there who probably didn't hate U.S. at the time, but by the time they left, were willing to join the jihad. And then there are others like Mohammed who don't want anything to do with war, Mohammed Jawad, my client, or just never want to deal with anything like that again. And so he said he would like to become a doctor so he can help people. Probably not realistic in his case, but very touching. So that's kind of the overall picture.
Got a question right here.
My name is Kate Rahm. I'm a student here at the Clinton School and at the Bowen School of Law just down the street. Thank you for being here. My question is about moral courage and leadership. We are a leadership school. We talk a lot about moral courage and what it takes to be a leader. I see you as a leader. I see that you have used your service to help the poorest of the poor, the lowest of the low. It's Gandhi principles that we talk about here. Can you talk a little bit about how your service has impacted your personal and professional life and the tensions and internal conflicts, if there have been any?
Well, honey, where are you? My wife is here. She can tell you if it impacted our personal lives. I think, you know, I never, when I took this position, a lot of people said, well, there were a number of different reactions. One was, hey, don't work too hard down there. I got a lot of that, you know. Well, we know you've been assigned to defend detainees, but don't kill yourself. Others were like, how can you defend these terrorists, these horrible people? I said, look, I don't know that they're terrorists. They're entitled to a presumption of innocence, and even if they are terrorists, well, then the government will be able to prove it in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt, and they'll be convicted and they'll get the sentence they deserve. So I have no problem with that. But when I started to take on the government and started saying things like Cheney is a war criminal, Rumsfeld is a war criminal, Bush is a war criminal, and as a military officer, you're not allowed to use disparaging words towards the president, the commander-in-chief, and but I did so in a careful and respectful way within the confines of the courtroom, where there's, I could argue. I mean, Congress said that I had to go and defend this person, and they were entitled to military defense counsel. So, but people still thought I was doing something that was probably not going to be favorable to my career, and that would probably result in my, being passed over for promotion or worse. And they pointed to the example of Lieutenant Commander Charlie Swift, who represented Salim Hamdan, bin Laden's driver. And when Charlie Swift was one of the very first military defense counsel assigned to commissions, and was told, your job is to help these people plead guilty. And he said, well, that's not really how I see my job. And the way he saw his job was to challenge the very existence of the military commissions all the way to the Supreme Court and win. Well, 1 week after the Supreme Court announced that he had won, it was announced that he had been passed over for promotion for the third time and would be forced to retire from the Navy. And also, about the same week, he was named one of America's top 50 lawyers by one of the legal magazines. So it didn't seem to add up. But I was confident that, well, first of all, if you are putting your career and your personal advancement ahead of your client, then you can't do the job. So for me, and this was one of the reasons that my boss, who was the chief defense counsel, liked to hire reservists, because we had a civilian career that we could go back to if things went to hell in a handbasket for us within the military. And he felt that we would be more fearless, and maybe that was true, but people said, don't do this. And actually, my client, Mohammed, I never forget, there was a general, Brigadier General Hartman, who we were alleging had exerted unlawful and improper command influence in the military commissions. And I was going to be taking him on in court in a very public way. And Mohammed said, oh, Major Frakt, don't do this. This nothing good is going to come out of this, and this is not good for your career. Don't do this for me. And I said, I mean, it was incredibly poignant, and just made me want to work that much harder for him, that this person that had been wrongly imprisoned for all these years and tortured, cared about my career. So I don't know if that really answers your question. But I kept looking back to my oath which was to defend the Constitution of the United States, and I was just doing that in the best way that I knew how.
Clark, one more question. You will do one question real quick.
This may, seem like an obvious question considering that he has, faced the greatest abuses of American power. But it also strikes me that young Mohammed was freed by the work of an American and by the Great Writ, which is a vehicle that embodies the ideals of our Constitution. So I'm curious, do you know, what does Mohammed think of America?
I had some conversations like that with Mohammed. Unfortunately, I was not able to see him in person after he was released, but we got him a cell phone that we could call him and talk to him, and he harbored no ill will or no anger towards America. What he has seen was that, and what he told me is that just like in Afghanistan, there are good people and there are bad people. There are people who will care for you and fight for you, and there are people that you would rather not deal with. I mean, Afghanistan is an incredibly corrupt place where there's all kinds of ethnic tensions and other problems. So Major Montalvo, I told you, my Marine buddy, he's gone back there a couple of times and essentially was made an honorary member of Jawad's family and tribe, and so it's really about he's judging each person individually and not saying America bad, something else good. I mean, he really did not feel that way. So he turned out to be the wisest one of all.
Well, let me say that I think this is one of the most incredible programs we've ever had here, and I want to thank you very much for coming.